What if the most unsettling thing about the government opening its UFO files is not what is in them, but what is still missing after they do? What if the answer to a question you have been asking for 50 years turns out to be another question? What if the documents, the footage, the declassified audio from astronauts in orbit? What if all of it comes out and the mystery gets larger instead of smaller? That is what happened. And here is why it matters. Since May 8, 2026, a government website called war.gov/UFO has received over 1 billion hits. Not millions. 1 billion. A sitting president ordered federal agencies to identify and release files connected to UFOs and unidentified anomalous phenomena. The mechanism has a name: PURSUE, Presidential Unsealing and Reporting System for UAP Encounters. It is a formal rolling declassification program, not a one-time data dump, not a political stunt staged for a news cycle. A structured multi-wave release of material that had been locked inside classified networks for decades, some of it for 70 years. The second wave dropped on May 22, 2026. 51 videos, 222 documents, 6 PDF files, 7 audio recordings, infrared footage from active military platforms, transcripts from NASA astronaut medical debriefings, written testimony from a currently serving senior intelligence officer describing an encounter that happened in 2025, not 1969, not during the Cold War, last year. For 50 years, the official position was that this was not worth serious attention. Swamp gas, weather balloons, misidentified aircraft, Venus on a clear night. The language of dismissal was so consistent, so practiced, that it became its own kind of answer. And people accepted it because the alternative was uncomfortable and because the people making the claims were often easy to dismiss alongside the claims themselves. That framing held for half a century. It does not hold anymore. What is sitting in that public database right now is not the fringe version of this story. It is military infrared footage from F-16 targeting pods. It is audio from astronauts on the Apollo and Gemini missions describing objects they could not identify. It is 116 pages from the Armed Forces Special Weapons Program documenting over 200 sightings near a nuclear weapons facility between 1948 and 1950. It is a weapons-quality targeting lock from a Reaper drone on an object that then accelerated and changed direction with no visible propulsion. These are not anonymous tips. These are official records from the most credible institutional sources the United States government operates. Here is the thing about what that means. When a government releases classified material and the official framing of that release is transparency, you expect the files to close something. To answer the question that justified the secrecy in the first place. What the second wave does is the opposite. Every piece of footage comes with a gap the footage cannot fill. Every document contains a sighting with no final conclusion attached to it. The government is not releasing these files and saying, here is what it was. The government is releasing these files and saying, here is what we documented, and here is the part we still cannot explain. The official position, stated plainly in the release itself, is that a significant number of these cases remain unresolved even after decades of investigation. That is the loop. That is what you will be chasing through everything that follows. Not just what is in the files, the footage, the astronaut testimony, the nuclear facility sightings, the 2025 intelligence officer encounter, but what the files reveal about the size of the gap between what the government has documented and what the government can actually tell you. That gap has been sitting open since at least 1948. It has been protected, classified, and kept out of public view not because there was a dramatic answer inside it, but because the answer inside it was the absence of an answer. And now that absence is public. 1 billion page views in less than a month. A third wave already announced and actively being prepared. The material keeps coming and the explanation keeps not arriving. The files are open and the mystery just got deeper. And that is exactly what the rest of this is about. On May 22, 2026, the Department of War released the second batch of declassified UAP files, 51 videos, 222 documents, and audio recordings that had been locked inside classified networks for decades. The formal mechanism behind all of this is called the Pursue Program, Presidential Unsealing and Reporting System for UAP Encounters. That is the actual name, and it matters because it tells you something about the institutional commitment behind these releases. This is not a one-time document dump. This is a structured, rolling process with a formal name and a dedicated government website. war.gov/UFO launched on May 8, 2026. By the time the second wave dropped, the site had received over 1 billion hits. 1 billion. That number does not happen because the public thinks this is a minor story. The second release breaks down like this: 51 video files, 6 PDF documents, 7 audio files, 222 total documents spanning multiple agencies, multiple decades, multiple sensor platforms. And the breadth of that material is the first thing you need to understand, because a lot of people hear government UFO files and picture a folder of blurry black and white photographs. That is not what this is. The video files include infrared footage captured by active military platforms. Not handheld cameras, not phone footage, targeting sensors from F-16S and Reaper drones, systems designed to achieve weapons-quality locks on fast-moving objects in contested airspace. The audio files include recordings from NASA astronauts made during the Apollo and Mercury missions. Astronauts describing things they observed in space in real time during official mission operations. The documents include Cold War-era military records, written testimony from currently serving personnel, intelligence reports from the 1970s, and mission logs that had been sitting in classified storage for over 70 years. Multi-sensory, multi-decade, multi-agency. That is the structure of what the government released. Not one type of evidence from one period. A layered record assembled from military branches, intelligence services, and NASA, covering nearly 8 decades of documented encounters. The fact that these materials come from different agencies with different methodologies and different sensor technologies, all pointing at the same category of unresolved phenomena, is the structural fact that gives the second wave its weight. Here is what a second wave means in context. The government did not release everything at once. The Department of War has already announced that a third release is actively in preparation. The Pursue program is explicitly designed for rolling disclosure, which means the public is not looking at the full picture. The second wave is a tranche, not a conclusion. Whatever comes next is already being assembled, and what that material contains is an open question that the second wave does not answer. What the second wave does answer, in part, is the question of scope. Before these releases, the documented public record of government UAP engagement was thin and contested. After the second wave, the public record includes infrared targeting footage from military jets, astronaut testimony from the Apollo program, Cold War military surveillance documents, and written accounts from people currently serving in senior intelligence roles. The scope is not ambiguous anymore. The government has been documenting these encounters continuously since at least 1945, across multiple administrations, across multiple branches, and the documentation kept accumulating. Now here is the part that the official framing makes impossible to ignore. The government is not releasing these files because it finally has answers. It is releasing them because Congress demanded it, and the president ordered it, and the public pressure had been building for years. What the files show is not a solved case, Multiple incidents in the second release remain classified as unresolved despite investigation. The Pentagon did not release these materials alongside a press conference explaining what the objects were. There is no accompanying report closing the cases. The materials are in the public domain, and the questions the materials raise are still open. That distinction is critical. Releasing documentation is not the same as providing resolution. The government has now officially acknowledged that these incidents occurred, that they were documented, and that they were considered significant enough to classify for decades. What the government has not done is explain them. Not the infrared footage, not the astronaut audio, not the Cold War surveillance reports. The official position acknowledged in the release framework itself is not that these have been explained and can now be shared. The official position is that these exist, they were real enough to document and classify, and we do not have a complete answer for what they represent. And the official position stated plainly in the release itself is that many of these cases have no explanation, not a tentative one, not a disputed one, none. February 12, 2023, over Lake Huron, a pilot fires a missile at an unidentified object at 20,000 feet, and that is where the official story ended, until the footage came out. Here is what was publicly known before the second wave. 2 F-16CM Vipers from the Minnesota Air National Guard scrambled in response to an unidentified contact. The object was flying at approximately 20,000 feet and was deemed a hazard to civil aviation. One of the F-16s fired an AIM-9X Sidewinder missile. The object came down over Lake Huron, which runs along the U.S.-Canadian border. Canadian authorities recovered debris. That was the public record. A shoot-down, a recovery, a brief news cycle. The Pentagon described the object as octagonal with multiple strings hanging below it and no visible payload, and then the story moved on. What the story did not include was anything about what the infrared sensor recorded after the missile fired. The newly released footage is 46 seconds. Military-grade infrared from an F-16 targeting pod, not a phone camera, not a civilian sighting. At the 20-second mark, the footage shows what the Pentagon's own technical description calls a radial displacement pattern, consistent with a high-energy event. That is the language they use. In plain terms, something fragments in all directions. You can see it. The initial object breaks apart in a pattern that is consistent with a direct hit from a high-explosive warhead. That part fits the official account. The missile connected. The object came down. That is what happened. Then something else appears in the frame, a bright white orb. It does not arrive fast. It does not look like debris. It floats through the frame and then it disappears. No fragmentation, no trajectory consistent with material falling from a destroyed object. It enters the field of view of a military infrared sensor, moves in a way that debris does not move, and then it is gone. The Pentagon's release includes this footage. The Pentagon's public description of the February 12th incident, as it existed before May 2026, did not mention it. That gap is where this gets difficult to close. This is where you need to pause and truly consider what comes next. The original public description of the object, octagonal, strings below it, no visible payload, sounds like a balloon. Unusual, worth shooting down over sensitive airspace, but physically explicable. Balloons drift, strings hang, octagonal shapes are not aerodynamic. The official description was consistent with something mundane that happened to be in the wrong place. That description was not wrong. The footage shows fragmentation consistent with a balloon-like object being struck by a high-explosive missile. The radial pattern at the 20-second mark fits. What it does not account for is the orb. Debris from a destroyed balloon does not produce a luminous object that floats through an infrared frame and vanishes. Fragments fall. They follow ballistic trajectories. They do not hover. They do not emit a signature that reads as a distinct, coherent object to a targeting sensor. The orb in the Lake Huron footage does not behave like material from a destroyed object. It behaves like something that was already there or something that arrived after. Now listen to what the pilot said. The audio, declassified and included in the second wave, captures the pilot describing what he was looking at in real time. The exact words are these: "I wouldn't really call it a balloon. I don't know what. I can see it outside with my eyes." That is a trained military aviator looking at the target through the cockpit, telling ground control that the word balloon does not fit what he is seeing. He is not speculating about extraterrestrial origin. He is not making a dramatic claim. He is saying with precision that the category he was given does not match the object in front of him. And then he fired anyway, because those were his orders and the object was a hazard to civilian aviation regardless of what it was. Here is my position on that. When a pilot says he cannot identify what he is shooting at, and the infrared sensor records something that does not match the debris pattern of the thing he shot, and that second thing was never mentioned in any public account of the incident, that is not a discrepancy you explain away with sensor noise. Those are three independent data points pointing at the same gap in the official account. The pilot's visual observation, the pilot's spoken description, the sensor record after the engagement. None of them fully agree with each other, and none of them fully agree with the public description of a drifting octagonal balloon. The debris that Canadian authorities recovered has not been publicly identified in the released materials. The recovery happened. What was found has not been disclosed in any document included in the second wave. That absence is its own data point. When the recovery of debris from a publicly acknowledged military shootdown produces no public identification of what the debris was, you are left with a gap that the second wave opened wider rather than closing. This is the footage that should not exist in the sense that the official account of this incident was already complete. A balloon-like object, a missile, a recovery. The story had an ending. The infrared sensor recorded something after that ending that the official story does not contain, and that the government has not explained. Not disputed, not addressed. Simply not in any account that existed before May 22, 2026. What the pilot saw with his eyes, what he said over the radio, and what the infrared sensor recorded are three things that do not add up to the same object. The Syrian footage does not ask you to trust an eyewitness account. It asks you to trust a military targeting system, and military targeting systems are not known for being easily confused. The footage was recorded in 2021 by an infrared sensor aboard a United States military platform. It sat on a classified network for 3 years before making it into the second wave of releases. A Reaper drone had achieved what the Pentagon describes as a weapons-quality targeting lock on the object. That phrase matters. A weapons-quality lock is not a casual detection. It is the threshold a military system requires before a strike can be authorized. The sensor had the object. It had it cleanly. And then the object moved, not drifted, not banked away, moved. Instant acceleration, abrupt directional change, no visible propulsion. The lock, which military targeting systems are specifically engineered to maintain on fast-moving objects, could not hold it. What does that tell you? Here is what instant acceleration actually means in physical terms. Any object that accelerates at the rate described in this footage subjects everything inside it to G-forces that would kill a human pilot. Not incapacitate, kill. The threshold for pilot blackout is around 9 G in a sustained turn. Fighter aircraft are structurally limited in part because the human body sets the ceiling on what the machine is allowed to do. Remove the human and you remove that ceiling, which is why some engineers argue that truly extreme maneuvers only become possible in an unmanned platform. Fine. But an unmanned platform still requires propulsion. It still leaves a thermal signature when it accelerates. It still produces a sonic event at the speeds implied by what the infrared sensor recorded. The Syrian object produced none of those. No exhaust plume, no acoustic signature, no aerodynamic control surfaces moving through the frame. Fast, then gone. My take on this is plain. When a weapons-grade military sensor achieves a firm lock on an object and that object then performs a maneuver that no known aircraft, manned or unmanned from any nation with a publicly acknowledged aerospace program can replicate, the honest response is not to file it away. The honest response is to treat it as a data point that the current physical model of flight does not explain. The Syrian footage is that data point. Formally. On the record. Released by the Pentagon. Now look at what else was in the same release. A third video, also from a military infrared sensor platform showing objects in formation. Not a single anomalous object. Multiple objects moving in a coordinated pattern recorded by the same category of sensor technology. The Pentagon released both. That is not an accident. When an institution releases two pieces of footage that raise the same category of question, the implication is that the question is not the product of one strange evening over Syria. It is a recurring observation across different platforms, different years, different geographic locations. That consistency is the part worth focusing on. The Lake Huron footage, which was recorded 2 years after the Syrian incident, showed a different kind of anomaly over a different kind of terrain, captured by different sensor equipment, and still arrived at the same problem. The object did not behave like a known object. The Syrian footage predates it by 2 years and shows the same category of behavior. The formation footage is a third instance. 3 pieces of material released together, all pointing at the same gap in what known physics and known technology can account for. There is an argument that sensor platforms make errors. Infrared systems can produce artifacts. Targeting software can misinterpret atmospheric distortion. These are real phenomena. The skeptical position has standing when applied to low-resolution footage from consumer equipment. It has considerably less standing when applied to a system that was actively computing targeting solutions on the object it was tracking. A targeting system is not passively recording. It is actively calculating velocity, distance, and trajectory in real time. It assessed the object as trackable. It assessed the object as a valid targeting solution. And then the object moved outside the parameters the system was built to handle. That is not a lens flare. That is not sensor drift. That is a targeting system encountering something it was not designed to encounter, and the data from that encounter is now in the public record. The question of what produced that data has no official answer. The Pentagon released the footage without a resolution. No subsequent press briefing named a foreign program capable of this. No intelligence assessment has been made public attributing the Syrian object to a known actor. It sits in the second wave of UAP releases alongside historical documents and Apollo audio and submarine footage, filed under the same designation. Unresolved. What that means for the broader picture of what the second release actually contains is something the individual clips do not capture on their own. The Syrian footage is not dramatic because of what it shows. It is dramatic because of what the system doing the recording says about what it could not track. The physics problem does not go away when you increase the quality of the sensor, which is what makes the Syrian footage different from everything that came before it. Between 1948 and 1950, something kept appearing in the skies above one of the most sensitive nuclear weapons facilities in the United States, and the people who documented it used words like orbs, disks, and fireballs that exploded mid-air. The second wave released 116 pages from the Armed Forces Special Weapons Program. That name matters. This was not a civilian observation program. This was not a hobbyist club filing reports to a local newspaper. The Armed Forces Special Weapons Program was the military body directly responsible for the development and custody of American atomic weapons. The people writing these reports had security clearances, technical training, and every professional reason to avoid putting something embarrassing in the official record. They wrote it down anyway. 209 separate sightings, 2 years, 1 facility. The objects were described consistently. Green orbs, disks, fireballs that appeared suddenly and exploded in midair. Witnesses reported erratic maneuvering, sharp turns, sudden altitude changes, movements that did not follow any recognizable flight path. Some objects disappeared without warning, some exploded and left nothing behind. These are not vague impressions from untrained observers. These are structured military reports filed in sequence from personnel working inside one of the most restricted programs in American history. Here is what that volume means. 209 incidents in 2 years is not an anomaly. It is a pattern. 1 sighting can be dismissed. 10 can be explained as a cluster of misidentifications. 209, documented in formal military language by people who understood exactly what they were looking at and what they were not, is something the Armed Forces Special Weapons Program took seriously enough to record, classify, and hold for over 70 years. Now bring in the Soviet report. A CIA intelligence file from 1973 describes a source observing a silent, bright green airborne object over the Soviet Union. The object formed concentric circles in the sky before disappearing. No sound, no propulsion signature. Green. The same color that appears repeatedly in the Sandia documents filed 25 years earlier on the other side of the world by observers with no connection to each other. Does that sound familiar? It should, because what the Sandia documents and the Soviet report share is not a geographic location or an operational context. What they share is the object itself. Same color, same silence, same disappearance with no physical trace left behind. And here is my position on that. When the same described phenomenon appears in classified military files from 2 separate Cold War adversaries, at 2 separate times near 2 separate programs with nuclear significance, the honest response is not to treat each file in isolation. The pattern is the data. You do not get a coincidence that consistent across 25 years and 2 continents without asking what is connecting them. The Sandia sightings were clustered in a specific window around a specific place. That place was at the center of American atomic weapons work. The timing was the opening years of the nuclear age when the United States was building and testing weapons that had no precedent in human history. Whether that proximity is meaningful or purely geographical, the Armed Forces Special Weapons Program clearly thought the sightings were worth documenting at scale. They were not writing incident reports for 1 or 2 unexplained lights. They were running what amounts to a sustained observational record of something that kept coming back. That is the part that does not have a comfortable resolution. 1 visit is strange. 70 visits is a problem. 209 visits over 2 years at a nuclear weapons facility filed by the program responsible for those weapons is a sustained pattern that the document itself never explains. There is no concluding assessment in those 116 pages that identifies what the objects were. There is no resolution section, no final determination, no official conclusion that closes the file. The reports simply stop. And then the entire record was classified and held until a public release in 2026. What was the Armed Forces Special Weapons Program afraid to say? That is not a rhetorical question. These were serious people operating inside a serious program. They documented 200 incidents because those incidents were real enough to document. They classified the findings because those findings were sensitive enough to protect. And they never identified the objects. That gap between the volume of documentation and the complete absence of an official explanation is the thing the second wave release surfaces without answering. 200 sightings near a nuclear weapons program in 2 years, classified for 75 years, and the official explanation for what was appearing above Sandia is still not in those 116 pages. Frank Borman was not the kind of person who misidentified objects. He was a test pilot, a trained engineer, and the commander of Gemini 7, and on December 4, 1965, he called down to Mission Control and reported a bogey. Not a reflection, not a debris field, a bogey. The word has a specific meaning in military aviation. It means an unidentified aircraft. Borman used it deliberately, and Mission Control took it seriously enough to ask a follow-up question that is now part of the declassified record. Gemini 7, are these particles in addition to the booster and the bogey at 10 o'clock high? The answer was yes. Pilot Jim Lovell confirmed it. "This is an actual sighting," he said, explicitly distinguishing the object from their own spacecraft's spent booster, which was also visible in the same field of view at the same moment. 2 test pilots in orbit with full visual on a known object, reporting a second object that was not the known object. That exchange stayed in a classified file for 60 years. Here is what that means. Borman and Lovell were not amateur observers reporting something they saw through a backyard telescope. They were the product of a selection process that filtered out tens of thousands of candidates to find the individuals best suited for exactly this kind of high-stakes, high-precision observation. They had identified their own booster. They knew what it looked like. They said the bogey was something else, and they said it clearly, and Mission Control documented it. And then that documentation was classified and held until 2026. That is not a footnote. That is a decision someone made about what the public was allowed to know. Move forward 4 years. Apollo 12, December 1969. Alan Bean is one of the astronauts. During a medical debriefing recorded on December 31st of that year, Bean described flashes of light he observed while trying to sleep in the dark of the spacecraft. His words were sailing off in space, not floating near the vehicle, not reflections from a porthole. Sailing. That word implies directional movement. It implies something traveling with purpose, or at least with trajectory. Bean was not a nervous person. He was a naval aviator and a test pilot, and he filed a formal account of what he saw, and that account went into a classified file and stayed there for over 50 years. Apollo 17, 1972. Ronald Evans, the command module pilot, reported very bright particles or fragments drifting and tumbling near the spacecraft during the mission. Lunar module pilot Harrison Schmitt described the same phenomenon. His description was the 4th of July. That is not a technical description. That is the language a trained scientist uses when he is trying to convey something that does not have a precedent in his technical vocabulary. Bright, fragmented, multiple points of light moving. Evans filed it as a formal observation. Schmitt confirmed it. Both accounts were classified. Now here is my position on the Mercury missions. The audio files in the second release include recordings from Mercury Atlas missions in which astronauts described small particles they could not identify, using words like light shavings and fireflies. The Pentagon notes that NASA later determined the fireflies were attributable to frozen condensation separating from the spacecraft body. Fine, that is a legitimate resolution for one category of observation. But that resolution does not travel backward and explain what Bean described in Apollo 12, or what Evans and Schmitt described in Apollo 17, or what Borman and Lovell reported in Gemini 7. The firefly's explanation covers one data point. It does not cover the others, and grouping them together as if it does is exactly the kind of conflation that kept these files classified in the first place. Here is the thing about the observer quality in all of these accounts. NASA's astronaut selection process in the 1960s and early 1970s was arguably the most rigorous human evaluation program ever conducted. Physical fitness, psychological stability, academic performance, flight hours, performance under stress. The people who passed that process were selected precisely because they were reliable, because they did not confuse one thing for another, because when they reported something, the report could be trusted. When those people in that environment, in a spacecraft with no atmosphere and no optical interference and no ground-level visual noise, reported objects they could not explain, the correct institutional response was to take the report seriously and investigate it. The institutional response that actually happened was to classify the report and move on. The Apollo 12 imagery makes this harder to dismiss. The second wave includes newly released photographs from that mission, zoomed in on a specific region near the lunar horizon. 3 dots in a triangular formation. The Pentagon's own caption on those images states that there is no consensus on the nature of the anomaly. Not that it was a camera artifact, not that it was lens flare or sensor noise. No consensus. The caption goes further. New preliminary government analysis suggests the image feature is potentially the result of a physical object in the scene. A physical object, near the lunar surface, in a photograph taken during the Apollo 12 mission in December 1969. That photograph existed for 56 years before the government acknowledged in writing that it might show something real. That is worth sitting with. Not the photograph itself, but the gap between when it was taken and when the government said out loud what it might show. Everything in this section existed before May 2026. The Gemini 7 transcript existed. The Apollo debriefing recordings existed. The photographs existed. The only thing that changed was the classification status. The only thing that was added was permission to discuss what trained observers had already documented decades ago. The Pentagon's own assessment of the Apollo 12 photographs now states that the anomaly may be a physical object in the scene, and that conclusion was classified until May 2026. The most recent account in the second wave is not from 1969 or 1973 or 2023. It is from 2025, filed by a currently serving senior intelligence officer who watched 2 large orbs float alongside a military helicopter for over an hour. That distinction matters. Every account covered so far carries the weight of time and distance. Borman called down from Gemini 7 60 years ago. Bean described his light flashes in a medical debriefing taped in December 1969. The value of those accounts is real, but they belong to a different era, a different sensor environment, a different institutional culture around reporting. This account belongs to last year. The officer was not recalling a memory from a career that ended decades ago. He was filing an official written report about something that happened to him and his crew while actively on duty in an active operational context in 2025. Here is what the account says. The officer and his crew were on a military helicopter investigating previous UAP sightings in an area that had already drawn official attention. During that investigation, they experienced what the officer described as a series of close UAP encounters lasting over an hour. 2 large orbs appeared alongside the helicopter, orange with a white or yellow center, emitting light in all directions. Not a directed beam, not a navigation strobe, not a shape that corresponds to any known aircraft lighting configuration. Light in all directions, sustained at close range for an extended period. The officer stated that he was virtually speechless. Now consider what this person does for a living. A senior intelligence officer is not an untrained observer who happened to see something strange from a civilian aircraft. This is someone whose professional function involves the collection, evaluation, and reporting of information under conditions designed to produce reliable conclusions. The cognitive toolkit required for that work is the same toolkit required to make a credible observation. Trained to assess what is known, what is unknown, what is ambiguous, and how to document the difference. And this officer's official conclusion was that what appeared alongside that helicopter was not something he could identify or explain. Fighter jets were scrambled. This is the part that deserves its own weight. The military did not dismiss the officer's report. It responded with interceptors. Pilots trained specifically to close on unknown aerial objects at speed, to identify them visually to assess their behavior and capabilities. These are not people who get confused easily in the air. They flew toward the reported location. They looked. And they came back without an identification. What were the orbs? The account does not say because the account cannot say. That is not evasion. That is the honest condition of the report. An intelligent, trained, credentialed observer watched two large luminous objects operate in close proximity to a military aircraft for over an hour and could not identify them. The military sent additional assets specifically to resolve the question, and those assets also could not resolve it. The report was filed, the files were released, and the objects remain unidentified. This is the version of the story that the Cold War framing tends to obscure. There is a habit of treating UAP incidents as historical curiosities, things that happened before modern sensors, before GPS, before the kind of layered military surveillance infrastructure that exists today. The Sandia documents are from 1948. The Gemini transcripts are from 1965. Even the Lake Huron footage and the Syrian acceleration clip feel at some remove from the present moment. This account does not. This is a 2025 incident documented in the same release as material from 7 decades ago, and the outcome is identical. The objects were not explained. The military looked and came back empty. Here is my position on that. The argument that UAP incidents are an artifact of older, less capable observation technology cannot survive this account intact. The officer was credentialed and current. The platform was active and modern. The response was immediate and professional. The gap between the encounter and the official release was 1 year, not 70. Nothing about this case fits the framework that assigns these incidents to a less rigorous past. The jets scrambled, they looked, and they came back without an answer, and the officer filed an official report describing objects that emitted light in all directions and made trained military pilots unable to explain what they were looking at. Here is the number that changes the entire framing of this: 2,000, not 2, not 20, not 200 individual incidents scattered across decades that could each be quietly explained and filed away. 2,000 formal reports, officially logged, officially unresolved, spanning from 1945 to the present day. The All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, AARO, carries that caseload right now. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth confirmed it. And the people who submitted those reports are not anonymous callers on a tip line. They are military personnel, active duty pilots, and government employees. Exactly the category of observer the government itself trains to identify aircraft, weather phenomena, and foreign technology. These are people whose professional function requires them to know what they are looking at, and they filed 2,000 reports describing things they could not explain. Here is my position on what that number means. When the government declassifies a single incident, you can frame it as an anomaly. When the government declassifies a pattern, you are dealing with something structurally different. 2,000 cases is not an anomaly, it is a data set. And the official position of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, stated in prior UAP reports, is that most of those cases remain unresolved. Not provisionally unresolved, not pending further review, unresolved. The file is open and the conclusion box is empty. Think about what it takes to reach that official acknowledgement. These reports pass through military command structures, intelligence review processes, and agency assessments before landing in AARO's caseload. The cases that AARO carries are the ones that survived that filtering. The ones that could be explained as sensor error, foreign drone activity, or atmospheric distortion were removed. What remains after that process is over 2,000 incidents that the most sophisticated investigative apparatus on the planet looked at directly and could not close. That is not a footnote. That is the headline. And for most of the last 8 decades it was classified. What makes this harder to dismiss is the 80-year span. Modern skeptics will often point to sensor limitations to explain Cold War-era sightings. Cameras were grainy, radar was imprecise, pilots were under stress. That argument carries some weight for 1948. It carries considerably less weight for incidents logged in 2019, 2021, 2023, and 2025. The sensor technology improved, the training improved, the reporting protocols improved, the cases kept coming. The gap in the explanation did not close. If this were primarily a function of poor equipment or unreliable observers, the rate of unexplained incidents should decline as the quality of both improves. That is not what the record shows. Here is the part that the American framing of this story tends to skip over. The United States is not running this investigation alone. Japan has a formal UAP investigation program. France has operated one for decades through GIPAN, the government agency specifically tasked with investigating unidentified aerospace phenomena. Brazil has maintained official military records of UAP incidents going back to the Cold War era and has released portions of that documentation publicly. Canada operates its own formal program. These are sovereign governments with independent intelligence services, independent military sensor platforms, and no institutional reason to coordinate their conclusions with Washington. They are looking at the same category of incidents. They are arriving at the same positio. A significant percentage of reported cases cannot be explained by known technology or known natural phenomena. That finding is not American. It is not the product of one government's institutional culture or one administration's political agenda. It is a pattern that independent agencies operating on separate continents with separate data keep documenting and keep failing to resolve. What that international consensus removes is the argument that this is a uniquely American problem of classification, perception, or institutional incentive. When France's government agency reaches the same open conclusion that AARO reaches, the explanation cannot be that American bureaucracy is distorting the picture. The picture looks the same from Paris, Tokyo, Ottawa, and Brasilia. Here is what the 2000 figure actually establishes, stated plainly. The question of whether something is happening does not require further debate. The institutional acknowledgement of that is already in the public record. It has been confirmed by a sitting Secretary of Defense. It has been documented by the Director of National Intelligence. It has been corroborated by foreign governments operating independent programs. What remains unanswered is the harder question: what is happening? And on that question, the official position of every government currently running a formal investigation is the same. We do not know. Japan, France, Brazil, Canada. They all have formal investigation programs. They are all looking at the same pattern, and they are all arriving at the same position, which is that a substantial portion of these cases do not have an answer. David Whitehouse is an astrophysicist. He reviewed the first tranche of materials, and his conclusion was direct. No hint, no evidence whatsoever of anything artificial and alien. That is a credentialed scientist applying the same standards he would apply to any data set. Eyewitness accounts are notoriously unreliable. The videos lack sufficient context to assess. Both of those observations are correct. They are not the product of bad faith. Here is the broader institutional version of the same argument. A 2022 Department of Defense investigation found that most UAP sightings could be attributed to birds, optical illusions, poor quality photographs, and foreign surveillance technology. Most, not all, but most. And that distinction is doing real work. When a body as invested in finding answers as the DoD reviews thousands of cases and concludes that the majority have conventional explanations, that is not something to wave past. It is exactly the kind of institutional finding that should anchor any serious examination of what remains. The core of the skeptical position is sound. Unidentified does not mean extraterrestrial. It means the observer or the sensor could not produce a confirmed identification. Those are not the same thing. Sensor artifacts are real. Infrared sensors produce blooming effects around heat sources. Motion blur creates apparent acceleration that does not correspond to actual object movement. Atmospheric refraction bends light in ways that can make a stationary object appear to move. These are documented, well-understood phenomena. None of them require invoking anything beyond physics we already have. The human memory compounds the problem. Eyewitnesses under stress compress timelines, misremember sequences, and unconsciously fill gaps in perception with expectations. This is not a character flaw. IT is how memory works. A pilot moving at several hundred knots, managing a targeting system, communicating with ground control, and tracking a fast-moving object is not operating under ideal conditions for precise observation. So where does the skeptical framework start to strain? Start with Lake Huron. The footage from February 12, 2023 is not a civilian video shot on a phone camera. It is infrared sensor data from an F-16's targeting pod. That system is engineered specifically to produce reliable thermal imaging of fast-moving aerial objects under combat conditions. It is not fooled by atmospheric shimmer in the way a consumer camera is. The question of sensor artifact becomes substantially harder to sustain when the sensor in question was designed to eliminate exactly those artifacts. And the pilot's own words, now declassified and in the public record, were precise. He did not say the object was confusing or ambiguous. He said he would not call it a balloon. He said he could see it with his own eyes outside the aircraft. Moved to Syria. A Reaper drone achieved a weapons-quality targeting lock on the object before it accelerated. Weapons-quality lock is a specific threshold. It means the targeting system has established sufficient confidence in the object's position, speed, and trajectory to engage it. That is not a blob. That is not a light smear. That is a military system at the operational threshold for lethal action, confirming a real physical object in space. And then the object performed a directional change with no visible propulsion and no sonic signature at the implied speed. The skeptical explanation for that specific sequence of events is not simple. It requires the targeting system to have achieved a false positive at exactly the moment the object appeared to demonstrate anomalous behavior. Then go back further. Gemini 7, December 1965. Frank Borman and Jim Lovell had already visually identified their own spent booster rocket in the same field of view. They knew what the booster looked like. They knew where it was. And they reported a second object, distinct, separate. Lovell stated explicitly that it was an actual sighting and that it was not the booster. Ground control acknowledged the distinction and asked for clarification. When two test pilots with precise situational awareness of a known object in the same visual field report a separate, unidentified object, the misidentification explanation requires them to have forgotten what they had just identified. That is a different category of claim from saying an untrained observer could not tell a balloon from a drone. And then there is the Pentagon's own reassessment of the Apollo 12 photographs. The new analysis did not conclude the anomaly was a lens artifact or a processing error. It concluded the feature was potentially the result of a physical object in the scene. That language is careful, potentially. But it is the government's own analysis applied to its own photographs, reaching a conclusion that directly contradicts the simplest skeptical reading. Here is my position on that. The skeptical framework is most powerful when it is applied to the weakest materials in this collection, and there are genuinely weak materials in this collection. Apply it there and it holds. Apply it to Lake Huron, to Syria, to Gemini 7, to the Pentagon's own reassessment of photographic evidence, and it requires you to explain away not just the observations but the specific controls those observations already contained. But there is a point at which the skeptical framework requires you to believe that multiple independent military sensor systems operated by trained personnel across multiple decades in multiple countries are all making the same category of error simultaneously. And that point is where the argument stops being skepticism and starts being his own kind of faith. Here is what you find when you do that. Nuclear facilities, military operations, active conflict zones, sensitive maritime assets. The Sandia documents cover 2 years of sightings above one of the most classified weapons programs in American history. The Syrian footage came from an active theater of military operations. The submarine encounter footage shows an unidentified object appearing precisely when a foreign submarine had surfaced and was being tracked. The intelligence officer's 2025 encounter was not a first contact. It was triggered by investigating previous sightings in that same operational area. These are not random coordinates on a map. They are the most sensitive locations the most powerful military in the world operates, and something has been appearing above them near the and apparently tracking them for 8 decades. That is not a coincidence pattern. That is an attention pattern. Now ask what the behavior looks like across those locations. Objects that maneuver without propulsion signatures. Objects that achieve instant acceleration after a weapons-quality targeting lock. Objects that appear in formation near maritime zones and then disappear from sensor range without a trajectory. Objects that outpace the fastest interceptors sent to identify them. No sonic booms at speeds that should produce them. No aerodynamic control surfaces operating in ways that produce the observed movement. Whatever these things are, they appear near critical military infrastructure. They demonstrate awareness of being observed, and they leave before they can be caught. That is not sensor error describing itself. That is a behavioral signature. Behavioral. This is where the evidence leads. If 8 decades of documentation show a consistent pattern of location preference and behavioral characteristics across multiple countries, multiple sensor platforms, and multiple generations of military technology, you are not looking at noise. You are looking at signal. The question is what the signal means, and there are only 2 serious answers. The first answer is that this is terrestrial technology. A foreign adversary or multiple foreign adversaries operating aerospace systems so far beyond anything publicly acknowledged that they make every known military aviation program on Earth look obsolete. If that is true, consider what it means. We are talking about technology that can achieve instant direction changes under a targeting lock, that produces no heat signature consistent with known propulsion, that operates near American nuclear facilities with apparent impunity, and that has been doing so since at least 1948. Not a recent development, not a sudden breakthrough, decades of sustained capability advantage so extreme that no classified American program has produced a working countermeasure in 80 years. If Russia or China has been running that program, it is not just an intelligence failure. It is the most complete and sustained intelligence failure in the history of organized government. The second answer is that it is not terrestrial. And here is the thing about that answer. The behavioral pattern does not become less coherent if you accept it. It becomes more coherent. Systematic observation of nuclear weapons development from the moment it began. Presence near military operations in active conflict zones, objects that track vessels and then disengage before interception. Formation behavior near maritime infrastructure. If you were mapping human military capability from outside it, this is exactly the operational pattern you would run. The locations are not random and the behavior is not random, and neither of those things requires an extraordinary explanation to state plainly. They just require looking at the data without deciding in advance what it is allowed to mean. And the government has not committed to either explanation, not formally, not after 2,000 cases in 80 years. That is worth sitting with. Not the mystery itself, the institutional non-answer. Because both explanations carry consequences severe enough that a commitment to either one would require an immediate, visible response. If it is a foreign adversary, the national security implications do not permit a rolling declassification schedule and a public website. They do not permit press releases and congressional briefings. They require emergency mobilization on a scale that would be impossible to conceal. The entire apparatus of American national security would be oriented around a single problem. That is not what we are seeing. The response to the second wave of releases was a government website with 1 billion-page views and a promise of more documents to come. That is the response of an institute in managing public curiosity. It is not the response of an institution confronting a peer adversary with an 80-year technology lead. What does that tell you? Either the government has assessed the threat as non-adversarial, which implies they have some basis for that conclusion that is not in the released files, or the pattern of behavior across 8 decades does not fit the operational logic of a foreign program, and the institution is genuinely without an explanation it is willing to state out loud. Neither option closes the question. Both of them deepen it. The pattern in the data points somewhere. The government is not pointing there with you. If this is foreign adversary technology, it is the most catastrophic intelligence failure in American history. And the government's response to that would not look like a public website with 1 billion-page views. It would look like something very different from what we are seeing. Here is the question the releases themselves raise and that none of the official statements have answered. If this material does not prove anything extraordinary, why was a Gemini mission sighting from 1965 still classified in 2025? The Sandia documents cover 1948 to 1950. The Apollo 12 materials are from 1969. The Gemini 7 bogey report was filed 60 years ago by 2 test pilots using technology that has been obsolete for decades. The standard justification for classification is the protection of sources, methods, or sensitive capabilities. Apply that justification here. What capability exactly was the government protecting by keeping Frank Borman's radio transmission sealed until 2026? What method was at risk if the public learned that Harrison Schmitt described lights that looked like the 4th of July from the lunar surface in 1972? The sensor technology aboard those missions is in museums now. The operational details are in textbooks. Whatever argument classification was supposed to serve, it was not that argument. Here is the institutional logic that actually explains it. When an organization classifies something it cannot explain, what it is protecting is not a secret about the thing. It is protecting the embarrassment of not having an answer. That is a different category of classification entirely, and it is one that almost nobody talks about openly because the people making those decisions rarely state the real reason out loud. The Cold War created a specific framework for this. Any public acknowledgement that genuinely unidentified objects were operating in American airspace carried 2 risks. First, public panic. Second, and more dangerous from a strategic standpoint, adversaries could exploit the acknowledgement. If the Soviet Union knew that American military personnel were filing official repo RTS about objects nobody could explain, that information had intelligence value. So the classification was not irrational. At the time, the reasoning held. The problem is what happened next. The Cold War ended. The strategic calculus that justified the original classification disappeared. But the classification continued. And here is my position on why. Once something has been classified for 20 years, releasing it requires someone to take ownership of the decision. Someone has to look at 70 years of unexplained encounters and decide that today is the day to open it. And that person inherits everything that comes with the opening. If the material is mundane, the question becomes why it was ever classified. If the material is significant, the question becomes why it was suppressed. Either answer is uncomfortable. So the default was inertia. Nobody wanted to be the person who opened it, so nobody opened it. That is not conspiracy. That is bureaucracy. And bureaucracy is often more effective at burying things than any deliberate cover-up could be, because it requires no coordination, no active deception, just the accumulated preference of successive reviewers choosing the option that carries the least personal risk. Fast, quiet. Nothing happens to you if you leave it classified. Something might happen to you if you do not. The 70 years of classification also created a compounding problem. The longer something stays classified, the more significant it appears to be. Institutional memory builds up around the sensitivity of the material. New reviewers see a file marked classified for decades and assume the original classifiers had a strong reason. They preserve the classification not because they have assessed the material themselves, but because the history of the classification implies the assessment was already done. That loop ran for 7 decades. The material became harder to release precisely because it had not been released, and the expectation of its sensitivity grew in proportion to how long it was held. What that loop produced is a public record that is now genuinely disorienting. When the Gemini 7 audio came out, people expected something dramatic because 60 years of classification implied drama. What they got was 2 pilots describing an object that did not match their booster rocket. That is significant. It is not a confession. It is a sighting report from credentialed observers, carefully documented, officially sealed, and then held for 6 decades. The gap between what was classified and what the classification implied is part of the story now, and the most important version of that gap is this. The government did not classify evidence of a dramatic discovery. It classified the absence of an explanation. Every document in these files that remains unresolved is not a record of something the government knows and is hiding. It is a record of something the government encountered and could not identify. Those are not the same thing, and treating them as the same thing is the error that has driven this conversation into mythology for 50 years. The material is real. The observations are documented. The explanations are missing. That is what the files show. Not proof of contact, not proof of technology, not proof of anything except that the encounters happened and that nobody in 70 years of institutional review produced a satisfying account of what caused them. What the government classified for 70 years was not technology, not methods, not sources. It was the official record of things that the most powerful military in the world encountered and could not explain. And that is a different category of secret entirely. The government has already announced the 3rd wave is coming, and what it contains is the question that makes the 2nd wave feel like a prologue. The Department of War has been explicit about this. A 3rd release is actively being prepared. Agency partners are involved. The announcement will come in the near future. Those are the official words. What they do not tell you is what is in the material, which agencies contributed it, or why this one required additional preparation time when the first 2 waves moved on a relatively compressed schedule. That gap between the announcement and the explanation is where this gets interesting. The 2nd wave drew from a wide institutional network. Military branches, intelligence services, NASA, documents from the Armed Forces Special Weapons Program, infrared footage from active Reaper drones, audio recorded inside Apollo capsules. Written testimony from a currently serving intelligence officer. The breadth of that sourcing suggests the government was pulling from every corner of the classification system it could access quickly. The third wave implies there is more. The question is whether more means more of the same category of material or something from a category that has not appeared yet. Here is where the congressional dimension matters. Anna Paulina Luna and Tim Burchett have not been making vague claims. They have been specific. Both have stated publicly that the government is holding information about encounters that go beyond unidentified aerial phenomena and into territory involving recovered materials and non-human intelligence. Luna was pressing for specific videos from the Pentagon months before the Pursue program produced them. She set deadlines. The Pentagon missed them. The materials eventually came out. That process tells you something. The legislative pressure that built the Pursue program did not come from lawmakers who were simply curious about blurry infrared footage. It came from lawmakers who believe the current releases are the opening of something, not whole of it. That is a significant distinction. If Luna and Burchett are right, the first two waves are introductory, calibrated to establish that the government takes this seriously, that the sensor footage is real, that the astronaut accounts are genuine, that the institutional record is legitimate. And then the third wave contains something that requires that foundation to have been laid first. That is one interpretation. The other is that Luna and Burchett are wrong, or that what they believe the government holds does not exist in the form they believe it does, and the third wave is simply more documentation of the same pattern. More incidents, more footage, more accounts from credible observers describing things that remain unresolved. Both are possible. Neither one can be dismissed based on what has been released so far. What would distinguish them? Think about what the first two waves did not contain. No recovered materials, no physical evidence, no documentation of anything retrieved from an incident site beyond the debris recovered from Lake Huron, which has not been publicly analyzed or described in any detail. No written acknowledgement from any government body that the objects represented technology not of human origin. The official framing has been consistent. These are unidentified. They are being investigated. Many remain unresolved. That framing stops short of every claim that would constitute a genuine escalation. If the third wave contains the same framing applied to new material, it is a continuation. If the framing changes, that is when this becomes something different, and here is my position on that. The structure of these releases is not accidental. Rolling disclosure programs do not happen by chance. Someone designed this sequence. Someone decided that the first wave would establish the portal. The second wave would include astronaut audio and active military footage and a 2025 intelligence officer account. And the third wave would come later. That sequencing reflects a decision about pacing. What you do not know is whether the pacing is designed to manage public absorption of genuinely extraordinary material, or to maintain the appearance of transparency while keeping the most significant material permanently in the next release. Those are very different purposes, and they produce an identical-looking process from the outside. The billion-page views on war.gov/UFO tell you the public is not treating this as routine. Lawmakers with Intelligence Committee access are describing material that would fundamentally change the framing of everything that has come out so far. And the government is telling you the third wave is coming without telling you what it contains or what criteria determined what goes in it. The structure of a rolling disclosure program is either the most transparent approach ever taken to a genuinely mysterious phenomenon, or it is a very carefully managed way of never quite arriving at the thing people are actually asking about. And right now, nobody outside the process can tell you which one it is. Both of those possibilities carry weight. Neither is accorded the institutional seriousness it requires. Here is the dark part of that. The government spent 70 years classifying the record of its own ignorance. This is worth examining more closely. Institutions do not typically classify information because it is false. They classify it because its release would create complications. The complications might be political, they might be legal, they might be embarrassing. But the fundamental act of classification is an act of control. It is a statement that certain information will not be available for public scrutiny until someone with authority decides it should be. The passage of time does not change the government's knowledge of what it is hiding. Time merely changes the political cost of continuing to hide it. Documents sealed in 1955 contained the same facts in 1975 and in 1995 and in 2015. What changed was not their content, but the calculation of risk versus benefit in keeping them closed. This calculation is made by institutions, not by individuals seeking truth. Institutions have institutional interests. Those interests are not always aligned with transparency. The classification of ignorance is perhaps the most revealing category of all. When an agency does not know something, it still may classify the record of not knowing. It may classify the questions asked. It may classify the investigations undertaken. It may classify the negative results. The act of classification itself becomes an admission that something occurred that the government wishes to control the narrative around. If nothing had happened, there would be nothing to classify. The very act of secrecy confirms that someone somewhere believed the facts mattered enough to hide them. Whether those facts provided answers or merely raised questions becomes secondary to the institutional need to manage disclosure. What has changed is not that the ignorance resolved. What has changed is that the classification became harder to sustain than the disclosure. The files opened not because the mystery closed, but because the pressure to open them finally exceeded the institutional comfort with holding them shut. This reveals something important about how institutional behavior actually functions. Secrecy is maintained not through the force of law alone, but through a kind of institutional inertia. As long as secrecy is easier than disclosure, as long as nobody cares enough to make disclosure harder, the files remain closed. But institutional inertia can be overcome. It is overcome by sustained public attention. It is overcome by legal action. It is overcome by the passage of time, which eventually brings new people into positions of authority who did not create the original classification, and therefore lack a psychological investment in defending it. It is overcome by the accumulation of similar requests, similar pressure, similar arguments repeated until they become impossible to ignore. Once disclosure becomes the path of least resistance. The files open not because the government has suddenly become honest, but because honesty has become administratively convenient. The files that do open often disappoint. They disappoint because they contain what they always contained. The disappointment is not with the files, but with the expectation that files contain answers. Many files contain fragments. They contain partial information. They contain questions without resolutions. They contain evidence that official processes were confused, uncertain, or unable to reach conclusions. The government can be transparent about its confusion. But transparency about confusion does not resolve the confusion. It merely makes the confusion public. This is an important distinction. The opening of files is not the same as the solving of mysteries. The disclosure of documents is not the same as the understanding of events. Science being comfortable is not the same as science being careful. And government being transparent is not the same as government having answers. These are fundamentally different conditions. A government can open its files and still not have answers about what those files mean. A government can be transparent and still be ignorant. Transparency is a procedural quality. It describes what is visible. It does not guarantee what is understood. Science can feel comfortable with a particular explanation while remaining careless about the evidence underlying that explanation. Comfort is a psychological state. Carefulness is a methodological standard. The two do not necessarily correspond. A scientist can be comfortable and careless. Another scientist can be uncomfortable and careful. The goal should be to establish procedures that make careful science more likely, regardless of whether it makes anyone comfortable. Similarly, the goal should be to establish procedures that ensure government transparency. Not because transparency feels right, but because it functions better as a system. When disclosure becomes too costly politically, when transparency creates too many complications, institutions will find ways to resist it. The resistance becomes more sophisticated over time, but it remains resistance. The fundamental institutional instinct toward control does not disappear merely because files are opened. The instinct only learns new methods of expression.